Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of our Gilded Age Symposium series. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the United States Capitol Historical Society. And we're grateful that so many of you have taken time out of your busy day to join us as we continue our exploration of this fascinating and important chapter of American history. Before we get into today's presentation, I'd like to go over just a couple of technical housekeeping matters as people continue to join us here. While we are still limited in how we can interact in person, we love using this Zoom webinar platform to engage with you, our wonderful audience and supporters. And there's a way that you can interact as we proceed through today's event. If you have questions for our wonderful scholars who will be speaking today, content-based questions, you can put those into the Q&A section of the webinar platform. That looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what kind of device you're using to join us today. If you have any technical difficulties, if you need some troubleshooting help during the course of today's program, you can put that into the chat section of the webinar, and I will respond to that in real time. So once again, any content questions for today's speakers can go in the Q&A section. Any technical troubleshooting can go into the chat section. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, to get today's program started. Jane.
Thank you so much, Sam. We really appreciate all the work you do to bring these programs to our members. And so to those of you who are joining us today from around the country and occasionally around the world, we thank you for being with us. We are midway through our series on the Gilded Age and looking at that period of time from about 1877 until the very early 1900s, and some very significant changes in economics, politics, and the way in which this country people interacted one with another. We have two very distinguished scholars today to talk to us about the rise of the labor movement, the engagement with economic inequality, and some of the responses to the whole question of labor and management. We will begin with Rosanne Currarino, who is an intellectual historian of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era America. Her book, The Labor Question in America, Economic Democracy in the Gilded Age, examines diverse efforts to redefine the parameters of democratic participation in industrial America. Her newest project, Oranges Incorporated, Incorporating America from the Ground Up 1870 to 1910, looks at Southern California's early orange growers who eventually formed Sunkist in order to reconsider how we understand the incorporation of America during the Gilded Age. Professor Currarino is the co-editor of the Journal of Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, earned her PhD at Rutgers University. Our second panelist is Suresh Naidu, who teaches economics, political economy, and development for the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. His focus area is the economic effects of political transitions, the economic history of slavery and labor institutions, international migration, and the economic applications of natural language processing. He previously served as a Harvard Academy Junior Scholar at Harvard, an instructor in economics and political economy at the University of California, Berkeley. He earned his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and is going to talk to us about some of the response to the economic inequality issue. So we will start, with Professor Currarino, who has given us the authority to call her Rosanne today. So Rosanne, take it away, and then you can pass it to your colleague. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Jane Campbell and Sam Holliday for inviting me here today. It's a real honor to be with you all. This is, the great thing about Zoom is it's a little weird, it's true, but it's such a great opportunity to meet and talk with so many people. So today I'm going to talk very briefly about the emergence of the modern industrial labor movement between about 1873 and 1900. I'm going to focus more on workers than I am on legislatures in this talk. I know legislatures are the usual subject of the US Capitol Historical Society, but the Gilded Age labor movement was worker driven. It grew because workers wanted more of the wealth that they were creating, though they disagreed about how to claim that wealth. The answer that comes to dominate by the end of this period, by the 1890s, by 1900, is the bread and butter unionism of the American Federation of Labor. And that answer sets the term for labor legislation and regulation in the progressive era and through the New Deal. So I'm sort of giving the background to the legislation that comes about in the progressive era. So labor unions don't begin in the Gilded Age, of course. Workers formed unions to promote their interests all through the antebellum period. Mostly these unions weren't national though, and they usually didn't last very long. The modern national labor movement really starts in the 1870s and develops through the 1880s and the 1890s. It was responding to three basic changes in work and the workplace. First, it was responding to the transition from smaller workshops owned by master craftsmen who also worked in them to large industrial factories, increasingly mechanized, and these were run by managers and foremen, not owners or craftsmen. Second, these larger workplaces were made possible by greater concentrations of capital. These were large business firms that controlled production from start to finish. And as a result, the third thing that changed that workers are responding to was a sense of loss. Workers felt like they had lost past opportunity, right? Things were no longer the same. Before, workers had wanted to become masters and own their own shops, and they thought they had a reasonable chance to do so. But now they were all going to be wage workers, including skilled workers, and that was that. They would not become self-employed, and they felt their lives were less secure and poorer. These three conditions helped inspire a growing national labor movement, but the spark for organization was the Depression that started in September 1873 and lasted for about 5 years. In some cities, it's really bad. In some cities, the unemployment rate reached more than 25%. Breadlines became a regular feature of urban life. Desperate for work and economic security, workers struck throughout the period or protested. The most famous of these protests and strikes was the violent clash between workers and railroads in 1877, the Great Uprising, it's called. And in response to the Great Uprising and labor protest in general, the House struck a select committee chaired by Abram Hewitt, Democrat of New York. And this committee traveled around the country asking Americans how they thought labor should be restored to its just rights. It's how they put it. How should labor be restored to its just rights? And the committee found no consensus. But over the next 20 years of basically a protracted economic downturn, two answers emerged to that question: how should labor be restored to its just rights? The first one rejected wage labor altogether. And this was the answer given by the Knights of Labor in the 1870s and 1880s. Now, the Knights began as a secret society, kind of the Masons for workers in 1869, but soon they weren't secret, and they grew quickly in the 1870s in response to the Depression and the troubles that workers were facing. The Knights wanted to organize all productive members of society. They would all be members equally within the Knights. So everyone from a manual worker to a skilled craftsman to shopkeepers, small businessmen. They welcomed women and African Americans. The only people they rejected were parasites, as they call them, non-producers who lived off the labor of others, bankers, lawyers, speculators. The Knights program was broad. It included calls for an 8-hour day, an end to child labor, no more convict labor, no more special corporate privileges, meaning land to railroads, basically. But their main goal was the end of wage labor. They wanted all producers to, in their words, receive a proper share of the wealth they create. And they thought they could make that happen by promoting cooperatively owned enterprises. That is, capital and labor would come together and be joint owners and managers. Now, the Knights are not socialists at all. They do not want to abolish private property. They do not want to end capitalism. They are not big fans of state intervention, but they do imagine this cooperative commonwealth. They reject, as a result, any true, the basis of any true antagonism between capital and labor. They oppose strikes. Instead, they favor arbitration. But by the mid-1880s, local assemblies found the official Knights line did not work in their modern workplaces. And instead, workers who were members of the Knights, but in these on the local level, began agitating more aggressively, especially for an 8-hour day. Between July 1885 and June 1886, workers on Jay Gould's railroad lines, which are mainly in the southwest of the US, struck repeatedly. They win shorter hours, they win higher pay, and because of their success, Knights membership increases by about 600,000, so a lot. But the Knights leadership came to distrust the strikes very much, and by 1886, they renounced the strikers. Membership drops very fast at this point. Workers felt that they could only get results, particularly better lives at home, more leisure time, if they were able to strike, and they felt betrayed by the Knights. They may have liked the idea of a cooperative commonwealth, this sharing between capital and labor, where every producer was justly rewarded, but they wanted immediate results of higher wages and shorter hours. Now, higher wages, shorter hours, and possible strikes, that was the second answer to Hewitt's Select Committee's question, how to give labor its just rewards. And that comes about in the late 1880s and into the 1890s, and it's tied to the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor was founded in 1886, in part it was founded by skilled craftsmen, but partly because they were dissatisfied with the Knights. And it accepted the conditions of the modern industrial workplace as given. They were large workplaces, big industry, permanent wage work. That's what we're working with here. The AFL did not worry about changing these, like industrial organization itself. It wanted to help workers get a better deal. Now, the AFL is a federation of trade unions, and so that better deal was for trade union members. This is mainly skilled white men. But for trade union members, for these men, the best possible deal by the 1880s, the late 1880s, was to be able to enjoy a growing consumer and society and growing leisure time. Leisure society is kind of world of mass leisure and mass consumption that their labor had helped to create. So the AFL demanded higher wages so that workers could buy and enjoy more non-essential goods and have more comfortable lives. Things like the AFL mentions, pianos, nice clothes, sofas, bicycles. And they wanted shorter hours so that workers would have time to be part of the emerging world of mass leisure, Coney Island, baseball, Asbury Park, the movies. At the time, and certainly since, the AFL has gotten a lot of criticism for this. Some think the AFL's focus on shorter hours and higher wages for skilled workers was too narrowly consumerist, without any agenda for broad political change or social reform attached to it at all. The AFL did not have any plans to revolutionize the means of production, believe me. But AFL leaders insisted that shorter hours and higher wages were a broad agenda. They thought they lived in a time defined by mass production and thus mass consumption. And if you're not able to participate in that consumption, if you're not able to buy things that you've made for yourself and your family, then, well, the AFL said, you're not part of society, just as surely as if you couldn't vote. When AFL President Samuel Gompers repeated labor wants more, which he said a lot, he was demanding that labor be included in, his words, all of the good things of life now and next year too. And the AFL was willing to strike to get more. Employers, bosses, corporations, they assumed, were not going to give labor more unless labor forced the issue. Labor forced the issue. And this was what many workers wanted in the 1890s and into the 1900s. And despite real setbacks and hardships faced by the AFL, their defeat at Homestead, the depression of the 1890s, their constant persecution under the Sherman Antitrust Act, the AFL survived. By the early 1900s, its membership began to grow quickly. The ideals of the Knights did not and have not disappeared, but the AFL's pure and simple trade unionism has set the terms for 20th century labor movements and for the terms of much of the regulatory legislation governing unions, work, and the workplace that came about in the progressive era and through the 1930s. And for more on that, I turn it over to Suresh. Thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot for that. So my thoughts are going to be a little bit less organized, but what I want to sort of talk about is the response of the various levels of American government to the labor conflict unleashed during this Gilded Age. But it's also, I just want to sort of put that the sheer levels of violence in the late 19th century are kind of, I think, unusual for, we generally think of the US as a peaceful country, but, in the late 19th century is when we have, I'm sorry about the background noise, is when we have the use of the federal militia. The overwhelmingly use of the federal militia in this time is Native American wars and strike breaking. And that often will be the case that and one of the reasons that it's the federal militia that's involved is because there's actually state legislatures are too friendly to labor movements to be reliable deployers of strike breaking. So basically courts get involved and the governors, for example, have to call on the federal militia because there's not necessarily the at home the local state support for it. And so just think that the primary place in which pro-labor legislation is happening in the Gilded Age, and partly in response to all of this labor conflict, is by passing various laws at the state level, and that includes things like maximum hours laws. It includes but also various laws that actually just make unions legal. So, the first law I know of is Pennsylvania in 1869 that makes unions legal, and then New York, and then Indiana in 1893. And so it's just like that, because before those laws, unions are sort of thought of as a conspiracy and restraint of trade. And so that's illegal. And so they can be broken by the use of federal militia. And so states are winding up passing a lot of labor law, but then what they wind up in conflict with is the federal courts, which basically find that a lot of these laws are in conflict with either existing federal law. For example, that some of them operate to restrain trade across states and so are violating the Commerce Clause, or famously with the Lochner case, making it that the law that was putting a maximum hours of bakers was in fact a violation of the 14th Amendment. And so then one of the sort of backstories of this is that as the states become more friendly towards unions, and so they get rid of this anti-conspiracy tool, then the courts sort of basically come up with the injunction in 1894, and that means that now a federal court can enjoin a strike, which means that you can now call in again federal troops to break that strike. And so I think there's a way in which the state governments are like too responsive to the people. And so the federal government is kind of the tool that employers are very reliant on. And in particular, the courts are the tool that employers are very reliant on to break strikes. And I also just want to flag that like the violence of the 19th century labor relations isn't restricted to the sort of the classic manufacturing sectors of the North. We also have this is the peak Jim Crow period in the South, where Black laborers and Black workers are basically, de facto kept in place by another system of state level laws. These are things like anti-enticement laws, anti-vagrancy laws, contract violations of contract breach that again, but here where the states are in the North, you can think the states are by and large like on the side of workers. In the South, they're very much on the side of like white planters. I think I just wanted to make sure that we're keeping the fact of like the South and Jim Crow as part of the Gilded Age is, I think, of a kind. And so what is then the counter movement is behind this, I think that it's realized by both progressives and labor reformers, is that you got to win at the level of the federal government to do this. And sort of some of this was anticipated by, for example, one of the demand of the Knights of Labor is for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because they thought it was really important that workers have access to the data about wages and standards of living across many cities. In fact, Terence Powderly was the proposed first Bureau of Labor Statistics commissioner. He was the leader of the Knights of Labor, and didn't get it, but it's interesting that there was already sort of a claim from the labor movement that they needed a federal Department of Labor in order to have labor at the level of the federal government sort of adequately represented. And so it takes a while, but they get it in the 1890s. And then along with that comes, for again, a push to tax the wealthy. And interestingly, in the 19th century, we do in fact have states in various forms have property taxes. They're taxing land, they have strange taxes on different forms of wealth, but these are thought of as very easily evaded. And so one of the other things that you get at the level of the federal government is a push for a federal income tax, which is actually spearheaded by the economists of the day. So Francis Walker, the head of the first American Economics Association, is a big advocate of moving towards like a federal income tax. And we don't get it until 1913. And you can think about a lot of these ideas about making the federal government more powerful. They're ideas, but they don't actually really get instantiated until about 20 years later. And particularly with World War I, when the federal government just expands in capacity and power, you get a lot of these ideas of what the federal government should be doing get instantiated. So let me just recap with that, which is that what I think is happening in the background of this period is massive inequality, massive conflict and violence. It gives rise to a set of like state level responses that are then hamstrung by the federal government and the judiciary that then so the response of that is for labor and progressive reformers to then try to exercise power at the federal level. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Professor. Now, you can stay with us. We're going to have both professors join us for the questions and answers. And we know, Professor Naidu, you do have to duck out a little early, but as long as you can be with us, we'll be happy to have you be part of this.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to hop off the video, but I can.
Okay. We can hear you. So here's the first question someone had is do you think that the 1873 depression was a contributing factor to the rejection of Reconstruction?
I'll take that. Yes, absolutely. So the depression is really bad, and it's really severe. It affects especially in the North, and it's in what we would call the Rust Belt. This is in industrial America. So these are people who are now really concerned with their bread and butter issues at home. They see problems out their door, and the South is far away. Many of them they believed in the Civil War, they believed in Reconstruction, but Black civil rights are not something they're particularly interested in, and they think they have a problem now. And so their interest in supporting Reconstruction diminishes greatly.
And you spoke about the Knights, you spoke about the AFL-CIO, and when you spoke about the Knights, you indicated that they intentionally involved women and even Native Americans or what about the role of ethnic minorities? Was that part of the Knights, the AFL-CIO, how did the early labor movement respond to the question of diversity and inclusion?
So the Knights of Labor are really unusual. They encourage women to join. Women are also producers. They definitely believe in the male breadwinner norm. Men should be the head of the household and earn money, but women can be producers too, and they should be members of the Knights. They also believe that African Americans should be members of the Knights. And there are some, the South is not heavily industrialized, but there's some work by the Knights in the South, and they do encourage, in theory at least, African Americans. Now, what happens, of course, is that this is all dependent on the local level. The local chapters are called assemblies, and these local assemblies may or may not be more or less inclusive. And there are real limits to their inclusivity as well. Terrence Powderly and the Knights, Terrence Powderly is the Grand Master Workman. He's the head of the Knights of Labor. He and the Knights agitate strongly for the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So yes, they have, as far as I know, nothing to say about Indigenous people at all. Doesn't even blip on doesn't enter. I could be wrong, but I've never seen anything that it's not something they talk about as people that they're trying to organize. The AFL, not the CIO. CIO's in the 1930s, and the CIO is going to be quite different in how it organizes, especially African Americans and to a lesser extent maybe Latinos. But the AFL is not interested in organizing African American workers or women. Again, at the local level, some of this does happen, but overall not as much. And they're much more committed, vocally committed to a male breadwinner norm. They're also not that interested at this point in organizing unskilled workers. So these are skilled craftsmen, semi-skilled craftsmen. Again, at the local level, on local chapters of unions can be different, and different trades unions that are in this federation can be different. But overall, they have limited commitment to Black workers and to women workers. And they also support Chinese exclusion.
Wow. Professor Naidu, I see your note that you need to be on your way. Do you have any closing comments for us as you move off to your next adventure? You're muted. Okay, I bet he must be gone. Well, we appreciate him offering his time. So, Rosanne, we're going to use your brain for the rest of the time.
I'll do my best.
It'll be great. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act was mentioned as part of the federal response. Can you give people a little bit more robust understanding of what that was and what it meant and how that played out?
I'll try. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is 1890, and it's sponsored by John Sherman of Ohio. And its stated goal is to it's against restraint of trade. So any unreasonable restraint of trade. And in theory, this could be used against Standard Oil or railroads that are colluding with each other to set rates, or any other, the sugar trust, the whiskey trust. There's a lot of the match trust. There's a lot of trusts or monopolies that this is in theory directed at. But in reality, it doesn't actually get used very strongly against monopolies, productive, corporation monopolies, industrial monopolies, until later. It's mainly used in the 1890s and into the early 1900s against labor unions as unreasonably restraining trade. And there are a number of court cases where the labor unions are, there's Gompers versus Buck Stove, I can't remember the exact name, where Gompers is, Samuel Gompers, the president of the AFL, is convicted of having restrained trade by organizing the workers. And it's quite effective. It's not until, and then it sort of diminishes somewhat, but it's not until the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 that labor unions are excluded from that kind of antitrust legislation. And then that's really solidified with the Wagner Act of 1935.
Well, that gives a sense of, we think about the Sherman Antitrust Act as sort of an, anti-monopoly, and the fact that it was early on used against organized labor is information that, we always in these things find that there are different things. The bills may be used differently when they were originally put in place than they are used in the way that we understand them now.
And I should add, I as far as I know, I don't believe that Sherman and the supporters of this act envisioned it as an anti-labor tool. Like, they didn't sit around and go, well, it looks like it's anti-monopoly, but we're really going to have this as a way. It got used that way. They very much saw it as a tool against restraining trade by corporations.
Interesting. Which sort of raises also the question about the federal courts that Naidu raised, where some of the federal court's interpretation may have been a little different than the original legislative intent.
And different as well than state courts. So Suresh was really good at pointing out the difference between state legislation and also rulings in state courts and even federal courts, and then the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, for instance, he mentioned Lochner v. New York, rules that it's a restraint of trade to tell bakers that they can't work more than, I can't remember what it is, 10 hours, I think, that they should be able to freely choose to work 15 hours. And even though the case has all this stuff about, they're breathing in flour and it's causing problems for their lungs, and it goes on and on and on. They're like, no. They get to choose themselves. You cannot restrain their opportunities. And so there's a lot of cases like that. But at the lower courts, don't necessarily go along with that. Some do, some don't. It's a mixed bag.
And one of the sort of pop, well-known kind of striking activity was in the Chicago packing house workers, where there was a lot of labor unrest, and that seemed to be a fairly diverse group of workers that came together. Was that part of the early AFL, or what was?
So the packing house strikes that I know about are a little later. There's certainly plenty to strike about in the packing houses, but I know about them a little later into the 20th century. And those are, I can point you to the books to look at to get the right information, but I know that the packing house is a much more diverse labor group. I should explain that the diversity by ethnicity, religion, and race is reflected in stratified workplace. So African Americans have the worst job in the packing house, which, in a packing house, the worst job is really bad, and they're paid the least. And so it's a diverse workforce, but it's also a divided workforce by the kinds of work they're given. But when they do strike especially in the 1930s, and then it's CIO, I'm pretty sure, I'd have to check to quote on that, but those strikes are notable for the cohesion across race, ethnicity, and religion. I don't know of examples of that from the 1890s and very early 1900s. A little later, yes. Right at this point, I don't know.
And were there any organizations that rose up that were led by African Americans or, Asian Americans in response to the fact that some of the organizations didn't fully engage them?
Well, there are occasionally separate Black chapters of local unions, but more commonly you see African Americans organizing separately, often not through official trade union formats, but at the community level amongst themselves. Some of these they can be through churches, they can be through national organizations or somehow attached to national organizations or locally. And some of these organizations are extremely effective and are ways that they agitate for better working conditions. But in other places, especially in the South, as I'm sorry, Suresh had to leave because he knows far more about this than I do. But in the South, they have a lot of trouble organizing in any way because employers use racism as a way to control the workforce and to prevent unionization of both white and Black workers. So for instance, in textile mills, textile mill owners and employers say to work in a textile mill, this is work for white people, and it's a suitable work for white women in particular. And at one point, I think it's in North Carolina in the early 20th century, white women workers go on strike. They want higher wages and less dreadful conditions. And the owners say, well, that's fine, but we're going to bring in Black workers. And they're like, okay, fine, that's it. We'll take the bad, we won't protest anymore. And if they do continue to protest, employers bring in African-American workers and pay them far, far less. And this is true as well in, especially in tobacco. So one of the, not the only, but one of the more highly sort of mechanized, but also in terms of distribution, sort of national firms is American Tobacco. And there's some other tobacco companies too, but American Tobacco, Duke owns it, is the big one. And they use race and racism to divide the workforce and prevent unionization by white and Black workers alike.
One of the things someone asked is about the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World. When did they come in and how did they fit into the mix of labor union activity?
So the Wobblies they're kind of great in their own way, but they're most important in the West, though they do some very important organizing among dock workers as well. They're national, but they show up in the early 20th century, and they are far more politically oriented than the AFL. They're not pure and simple unionism. They want higher wages, shorter hours, but they want political control. It largely depends on the particular area they're operating in, but they call for a kind of a socialist, leftist, worker-led society. And they have they're also very diverse. The AFL, I should explain, is it's extremely bureaucratic, right? There is a central office, there are vice presidents, there are annual meetings, there's a lot of, they don't have control over the local unions, but the AFL itself is a very centralized organization. What individual unions, the United Brotherhood of Carpenters or the Amalgamated Steel, what they do is, can they do their own thing, but under the organization, it's very organized. The Wobblies are much more spontaneous, much more responsive to local needs. They're particularly important in mining in the West. Big Bill Haywood, I always want him to be Wild Bill. Big Bill Haywood is the sort of primary organizer there, and they really push back against capital, like not just capital, but capitalism. And this is a kind of rhetoric that you just don't see in the American Federation of Labor, nor did you see in the Knights. But they're a little bit later. Then I stopped in 1890, but they are a progressive era phenomenon.
Okay. Now, here's the question we sort of always come to is the role of the sort of industrial titans that emerged during the Gilded Age, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, who have extraordinary wealth, extraordinary influence. How does that play into the development of the labor movement? And do they have any, touch with that?
They do. And so, I mean, it depends. I hate to say that, but it does depend. And it depends not just on who we're talking about, but the moment we're talking about. So, Rockefeller, for instance, can be very, or Carnegie, for instance, can be very interested in supporting certain parts of the labor movement. But then when it comes time to break the amalgamated with Homestead, he's given all this money to libraries, and he talks about, how workers should have rich intellectual lives. And then in 1892, he's like, yeah, we got to break that amalgamated. I go to Scotland, Henry Clay Frick, you stay here, call the Pinkertons, we'll solve this problem. Rockefeller at Ludlow in 1912, I'm not sure about the date, around then, calls in, he just shoots a lot of people. At the same time, a lot of industrials were very concerned, as were many Americans, that there would be in the 1880s, 1890s, a second civil war, this time between capital and labor. And they wanted to find a solution that prevented civil war, but that also accommodated the new reality of wage work, their need for partnership with a workforce. And so you have people like August Belmont, Carnegie at times, other industrialists who strongly support things like the National Civic Federation, which was a way of an organization that starts out in Chicago and then moves nationally, that tries to bring together capital and labor to discuss the problems of today as a problems that they share. So Gompers is part of the National Civic Federation. Large industrialists they hold meetings on trust, they hold meetings on strikes, these national conferences, they bring in leading economists, people like John Bates Clark, E.R.A. Seligman, the father of the progressive tax. These are people they bring in to sort of help think through these things. And that this is a way in which they try to, I wouldn't say that they're pro-labor, but they try to sort of accommodate or work together with labor. There are, and it can be the same industrialists, you can say this at the same time, but a lot of corporate leaders understand that by the 1900s, the corporation, the joint stock company, this large merged corporation is the way that capital will survive and the way to have a successful production. But they also think that if capital incorporates, so too does labor, and the union is the reflection, or the labor's version of the corporation. And so they are willing to work with unions as unions. And then, if push comes to shove, they'll they will suppress a strike violently. But in theory, at least, and in somewhat in practice, they do try to work and accommodate unions.
Well, this certainly has been fascinating. You know, as we talked in the early, you know, getting ready session, we always end our sessions with asking our distinguished scholars to share with the audience if you had sort of one thought that you would want to make sure that people knew and understood as they looked at the emergence of the labor movement in the Gilded Age. What would you want people to know and remember out of our time together?
I think I would say that the labor movement, particularly the organized, this sort of high-level organized labor movement, was an insistence on the part of workers to be full economic members of society, and an insistence that economic participation was, I mean, not that it hadn't been before, but was now a necessary part of democratic life, and that it was right for them to be able to enjoy the pleasures of modern life. That mass production and mass consumption had, yes, made them permanent wage workers, and it was hard work, but it also meant that they could and they should be able to enjoy all of the abundance that they had created. That pleasure is a right and is something to be strived for.
Well, that certainly is a fascinating perspective. And we thank you so much, Rosanne, for your time, your talent, and for, you know, carrying the day. As we know, and our listeners often know, this is recorded, so people are able to listen to it later, and we will send the notice to the recording. And we always invite our speakers to share with our readers books that you think that they might want to look at. And we have a book list from you that you sent us, and so we will be sharing that with our readers, so that our listeners, who we know are readers, and so that they can learn more as we move forward. And we really appreciate your being with us. We thank all the participants who are here and invite you to join us next week as we continue our Gilded Age Symposium, looking at the disparate economic impacts on different communities of the changing economics during the Gilded Age. We then turn to American art and culture during the Gilded Age. There was a lot of interesting developments in that area. And we then go into the week before Thanksgiving, where we are honored to have a distinguished scholar who has focused on the mythology and the history of the first Thanksgiving from the perspective of the indigenous people. So that should be an interesting conversation on Tuesday, November 16th at noon. And we have a book talk from Robert Watson on George Washington's final battle, which is really the battle to create Washington, D.C. as the capital city. So we'll be honored to have him join us at that time. As you know, all of these are free and available to the public because of the investment that each of you makes as a member and supporter of the Capitol Historical Society. We also want you to start thinking about the fact that it's coming on the holiday time, and we have the most fabulous ornaments for your Christmas trees made from the Capitol marble that was donated to the Society many years ago. So we have ornaments that have images of the Capitol, Christmas trees, all kind of good things. So As you think about your holiday gifts, think about the fact that you can do good and support the Capitol Historical Society while you provide special commemorative gifts to your friends and neighbors. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you next week. Be well. Goodbye.